Good afternoon, Mr. McWhorter. This is the second lecture for the Security Foundations course that began last week on 5/14. Last week we covered the first 5 lessons, and I hope all that was pretty straightforward. We didn't get flooded with a lot of questions, and it looks like some of you are progressing and some of you aren't. So if you're watching this video later, or if you show up, take a look. We've only got a few more days this week to progress. We're going to cover the last 5 lessons today. And those are going to pick up right where we left off, actually. We had ended the week last week talking about some very important security principles that you get thrown at you over and over again. You use them throughout your life, and you get questions on them on network and security and various types of tests. So we talked about separation of duties and rotation of duties as all part of a layered defense structure, which was the most important concept from 5, the whole defense in depth or layered defenses as it's referenced. So we're going to talk about some additional concepts in lesson 6 that are, once again, things that you need to be aware of, and you want to take these into account as you're designing security controls, once again, either tactically, how are we going to configure a particular system or set up a particular narrow policy, or strategically, what is our bigger architecture of our network? What is the bigger structure of our policy? What kinds of things? And we're going to talk about some more about policy here in a bit. But so these last 4 concepts, we're going to cover them a little differently than they are in the lesson, sorry. But they're diversity, limiting, simplicity, and obscurity. And actually, that's the way I'm going to cover them in that order. That's slightly different from the lesson, but those are the 4. Diversity is actually the one that in many ways goes very well along. They all do, obviously, but the most directly correlated in working with defense in depth is diversity. We talked about defense in depth being the idea like the castle with all those layers of defenses, or that we might have, of course, a firewall and different types of other security products, and as well as procedures and people that are all layered to help defend our corporate IT infrastructure. So what is diversity, and how does that factor into it? Well, diversity is not about sort of diversity of gender or races, that use of the word diversity, though it's in the sense of what we're talking about in security, it's a similar application. We not only want a layered defense, but we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So from a technical point of view, or even from a policy point of view, we don't want to, go with only one vendor, for example. The problem with that is, you can build a great layered defense with, pick the top, Cisco, Juniper, or whoever that you want to use, and you use all of their equipment, firewalls, intrusion detection, and everything. And then let's just say, hypothetically, it's actually, theoretically and in reality, these types of things have happened before, where what's called a zero-day exploit. Somebody figures out a hole in an OS or in underlying operating system, and then they're able to just own all that stuff. So if somebody did that to your vendor's equipment, and they got the underlying Cisco OS or the underlying Juniper OS or whatever the case may be, then the odds are that they're going to be able to use that exploit to bypass all of your layers. So here you have all these wonderful layers, and they've just walked right past them like you didn't have any at all. So the idea of diversity is we want to add some additional controls, both technical and procedural and people, into the process, so that we can make sure that not only do we have that layered defenses, but there is sort of no single point of failure. So while we might, and sort of like how there's a trade-off between security and convenience in general, this is one of these things that applies in some ways more to, say, the admin people, if you will. If, on one hand, from a security point of view and diversity concept, we could be the most secure by almost having every piece of equipment different. Well, that's an extreme, and that may not be even from a diversity, because then we're going to counter one of the next things we're going to talk about, simplicity, but we'll come back to that. But the idea being that of course would make our life difficult. Every piece of equipment would be different. Every router and firewall and switch would be different vendors, different models. So our patching and maintenance and all kinds of stuff would be a problem, which might actually lower our security in other ways if we weren't able to keep up with that. But from just strictly a diversity concept, that would be the most diverse possible. But like everything else, there's trade-offs. So we don't want to do that to our system admins and to ourselves. We don't want to have to configure 5 different types of firewalls. what we want to do is find that balance in here and have some diversity in our protections, and not just in our, sure, we use a firewall by vendor A and we use an intrusion detection by vendor B. That's an example of technical diversity. We might, have certain people in certain roles that are, of course, involved with our security. Sorry, my stat screen went blue, not that one. Hopefully it's not blue on the video. But anyway, and so we might have different roles, different people assigned to do different things. If we're a big enough organization, we might have, as we'll talk about in much later classes, but we'll have different security roles, and we might even have our own red team, blue teams, that are internal, that are part of, and quickly as a definition there, if you haven't run across that phrase, but that's sort of a military concept as well, but technical wargaming, where the red team acts like the attackers and the blue team the defenders. And that is actually a people and policy control to put that in place and to run those exercises on a regular basis to test your own security. And so by doing that, along with training and other types of policies, we can have diversity in all of our security controls. So we have technical control diversity, we have procedural control diversity, we have people and role diversity. And these will help increase the security by not having that single point of failure, and basically adding, even in a sense, more layers to our defenses. It has to be balanced like everything else, with budgets and with the trade-off of, we don't want to support 1,000 unique pieces of equipment, but we don't also want to put everything all in one basket too. So that's the diversity concept. Limiting is a super important concept. Basically, you're going to see this come back everywhere, in the sense of, the concept of limiting is that you limit access to stuff. It's really that simple. We want to do that in all kinds of ways in security. We want to limit the read-write permissions of files to people. We don't just need to give the whole company read-write permissions to everything, for various reasons: accidental deletion, malicious stealing, to a crypto virus getting in and running around the network shares and encrypting everything because everybody has write access. And if certain users only need read access, then let's give them read access only. Let's give people, let's limit the permissions and access they have to pretty much everything, up to the point that they can do their job, of course. Once again, balancing what we're trying to really do is, facilitate our organization's success. So we want to make sure people can get the resources they need, but we want to not give them anything more than they need to get their job done. So if they don't need access to a particular file system or a particular file closet, server closet, then they don't need access to it. And so we want to, wherever possible, limit access. And so you'll see it in physical access controls. You'll see it in file permissions and database rights and all that kind of system level permissions that you've probably already learned about in future, just like you could mark a file read only or not, in your own system if you're sharing it across your neighborhood, your network house, your house network. So, excuse me, allergies killing me again today. But they also want to use limiting in other areas. You're going to see when we get to talking more about firewalls, you'll have your first exposure in the next class, network foundations, and a little bit more in other classes as we talk about defending our network using firewalls. Well, we go to limiting extreme. Usually there, the idea is explicitly we deny everything. We limit everybody's access to anything, and then we only open up the various ports that we need to have. And so once again, this is a limiting concept. So it applies to firewalls, it applies to file permissions, it applies to everything. And I think that's probably the easiest one to understand. Then simplicity actually seems maybe counterintuitive, but if you think about here, we've talked about, let's have a very diverse, layered experience, layered security, add some diversity into the mix. Let's limit people's access so we have only certain. So we're building our security, and as you can tell, we're starting to get complex with it. And of course, if we take that too far, that's why the concept of simplicity comes back in. It comes back to everything else. I always like to say, kind of as a balancing factor for us. It's like, okay, we've been told to do all these things. Can we, what can we do to not go too far with it? We don't want to have, sorry, there's some noise in the background here. Don't want to have, like I mentioned, even in university, we're not going to go so far as to have every single piece of equipment be different, because that would be too complex, too much of a pain to maintain. We would probably be, from a diversity score, really high. Okay, that's the most diverse system I've ever seen. But if we then really went in and analyzed that, looked at it, we'd probably find that people were falling behind on patching. Not every machine was up on the same cycle. Different machines, because they're all different. They have different patches. There's no organization. And so some vendors better than others at getting patches out. So we could probably find a hole there, maybe just because of a latent vulnerability that hadn't been patched yet. And of course, people have a tendency to cheat if you get things too complex. If, for example, you make a super complex policy of, 3 or 4 people have to sign off to get access to a particular room or a particular server, and to get onto that live system. I think I used an example of one of the lottery gaming companies that had a very secure policy like that, where multiple people had to sign off, and then somebody had to watch what was going on. And of course, in their case, they enforced it and they made sure it happened because it was that important. And even though that was complex, it was worth it for them to give up the convenience to ensure the security. But you wouldn't want to do that to somebody accessing just the phone list of the company or something. We don't need that many, because if you make it too hard for people to do their jobs, then even if we use that example, like I said, this one server over here, only people get access to temporarily. They have to get permissions. So I go do it in the morning because I need to do some work on it, and I get my credentials for the day so I can work on that machine. And then Sally looks over and realizes I'm done, and she's going to have to go do the same paperwork, get 3 permissions, and get her credentials. And she's kind of like, hey, Lee, can I use your credentials? And because maybe I want to not have to go through that next time, and I can borrow her credentials, that stuff starts to happen. Or people post their very complex passwords that they're being forced to remember and change daily up onto the post-it note, or they just add a number digit onto the end of it so that they can keep remembering it. And because we've made things so complex that people are cheating and they're not getting the best results. So we want to keep simplicity in mind. So the last one we talk about is obscurity. And obscurity is one that actually fascinates me because there's such a controversy. A lot about what we do in security is pretty straightforward. There's the bad guys trying to get in, and we're the good guys trying to stop them. There's gray in there, like everything in life, and there's a lot of black and white here. There's the bad guys and the good guys. And so if you have permission, if you work for a legitimate company, you work for white hats, you work internally for a company defending wearing the white hat, even if you are on the red team attacking your company, you have permission. So you're still really a white hat. You're just trying to find weaknesses so you can help your company defend them. And so there's not a whole lot of controversy about that. Bad guys, good guys, different things. It's a war. We're having this race. But obscurity as a concept within the security field is hugely controversial, actually, and it kind of amuses me. I have found throughout my life that when you see controversial things in extreme positions, that I tend to look at the farthest extremes at both ends and kind of look at what they're saying. And generally speaking, what I find is somewhere in the middle. That's where I stand on this. There are people who believe that the idea of obscurity, which is the idea that if you keep things secret, you can keep things secure. That is a beautiful thing. It works, and there's all kinds of uses for it, and implemented properly, and in an ideal world, that it would be almost flawless. But then, of course, we don't live in an ideal world, and there's people on the other end that are thinking it's completely worthless. You can't keep secrets. People don't keep secrets. There's people way, especially in these days, to reverse engineer things, social engineer things, figure out things, steal things. And so how are we going to keep secrets? And so how would this help us? And so what's an example of security? I mean, security by obscurity. And then why do I think there's some place in the middle? You'll get to make your own decision in the exercise, but it comes down to, let's take something as simple as a web server. I always use this example. Most people can get this one. Web servers operate typically on port 80 if they're non-secure, just regular public web server. And of course, you couldn't use this. You wouldn't want to use this trick I'm fixing to discuss on your real live public web server because of that security versus convenience thing, and particularly for your users. But so if you have a public web server and it's sitting out there and you want people just to be able to come to xyz.com and come to your domain, you don't want them to have to put a colon at the end and some funky port number. You're going to leave that web server at 80, and you can't get anything by obscuring the location of that web server, because you would cause more trouble than it's worth. But let's say you have a little testing server that's like, that you have over here, that is, your user acceptance testing staging area that's right before you go to production. So we've had some developers put some code out, and now our testers are going to pound on it. And this system is, kind of a mirror. It's the ideal world in the sense of, we'll talk about that too, secure development later in the program. But you have a system that's very similar, if not exactly, to the one that you're going to go live on. So you can do that final testing and make sure it's not going to break anything. And so this machine is still a web server, and you want it to be accessible even, say, from the outside, because you're going to check it to see what the user experience is like. You don't want it to be on your internal network only as a test of how it's going to work in the real world. You need to have it out there. So you're going to put this little test server out there. Only so many people know about it, that kind of thing. It's only so many people and testers in your organization need to use it. Now, in this case, this is one of these cases where in narrow areas, I believe obscurity can help, because I can change the web server to operate on whatever port I want. Really, we can configure web servers. Every service can be changed. All of it can be messed with, configured. So we could say, we're going to stick this way up. We're going to have this be, our web server is going to run up in 20,080 is the port we want our web server to operate on. Okay. So this means that, yes, our half a dozen or dozen developers and testers are going to have to go to that IP or whatever dev server dot, whatever we call it, but then they're going to have to put a colon 20,080 at the end, and then the web server will answer on that port, and it'll work just like any other web server, because all we've done is switch the port. And so that's a little inconvenient for those people, but they can bookmark that URL, and once they're there, the links will work. It'll click around and keep passing that in. So, okay, not a huge inconvenience for them. So what did it gain us? Well, the folks that say the obscurity does nothing will say it gains you nothing. You gain nothing from that, Lee, because by doing that, a skilled hacker is going to scan and find that your web server's up there, and I will completely concur. I could find that, and you will too by the end of learning how to run Nmap and the various scanning tools. It's not like we're going to hide from somebody targeting us. But there's also, we talked about last week, a large amount of traffic that actually comes out of what we call script kiddies, or the bot-based automatic kind of attacks. And most of these attacks, and because that's what they're programmed to do, is to go after sort of the low-hanging fruit, they're not looking for web servers on 20,080. They're only attacking web servers on 80. If I go look at the web logs of sites I host, I will see all kinds of hits because they're all public and they're all on port 80, and bots and script kiddies will run these attacks against them trying to log into a WordPress site. It's not even a WordPress site, trying to run an exploit like it's a Windows server. It's a Linux server, but whatever. I mean, you'll see these things in your logs, and you'll learn about all that too in the logging monitoring course. But those attacks are constantly hitting those machines because they're publicly accessible. And so if we, on this little dev server, throw that up to a different port, then all of those just go away. And so to me, okay, no, it's not a panic. It's not the, yay, obscurity can do everything. Keep it secret and it'll all be super secret. No, I don't believe that at all, because I'm kind of in that. We can figure things out. We reverse engineer. We'll steal, hack, the bad guys will use all the tricks in their trade to get through. So, or just an insider who knows the secret will set you out. So, I mean, that is not a be-all, end-all. But I do believe in certain cases that you can use some obscurity and gain some value. I'm not saying moving that development web server to 20,080 is the be-all for it. No. A skilled hacker can find it. I can find it. You'll be able to find it. That's not the issue. It's just that we took 40-50% of the generic automatic script kiddie, new amateur, got his computer at Christmas. All of that never even gets to that server because it's just attempting to hit things. Even if they found it on a scan that, oh, there's a server up here, and if they're attacking web, they're going to be attacking 80 by default. If they want to attack that machine, then obviously they will. But that also means that you can set up rules. For example, you could have your firewall block 20,080 from the outside of your network, except during the windows you want to do testing. And now the hacker can't even get there. Only whitelisted internal addresses can. So you combine some other security controls with a little obscurity at times. and you can gain some value, particularly at least removing yourself from the low-hanging fruit. So I'm kind of in the middle. Where you come out, you'll let us know in your exercise, because there's an exercise related to that here. So then the next thing we want to talk about is, okay, we've learned sort of what security is. Our goal is to help protect the corporate infrastructure and IT. We're going to use all these different theories and security controls and people, product, and procedures. So okay, it's down kind of complex. How do we bring all this together? Well, these next two lessons are actually about what are called security frameworks. Thankfully, because people have been doing this for a while, we do not have to start from scratch. So like, theoretically, if you went to work for a brand new company and they hired you and they said, create our security policy and go, oh, okay. Well, obviously, you wouldn't just have to take what you learned in this class and sort of figure it out on your own. That's actually one of the things right now we're going to teach you. There's a lot of frameworks. If you were going to write your first resume, for example, or build it for house, you would go, look at a template, you'd look at some other blueprints, and so you'd look at some resume templates, decide what you like. You'd look at some other houses, and then of course you draw a blueprint so you could build your house. You'd plan. When we want to put together our security plan, our policy for the entire company and all the sub policies that need to fall into that, we're just not going to start with a blank slate. We can do the same thing. We can go out there and look. There are lots of entities. Most of them governmental or quasi-governmental entities, regulatory bodies, but in many cases are standards bodies. But there also are industry groups, and they put out these. Basically, they're just templates. Here's a whole stack. If you want to imagine, usually it's digital download. Go download a bunch of PDFs and stuff from their site, but you basically get this template, and they're all a little different. They all cover different industries. And so we're going to cover a number of them because it actually turns out to be very important to sort of look at different ones and sort of take the best from all worlds to build your own security policy. So in lesson 7, we talk about PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard. This is a great one to talk about first because it's more simplistic than the others. In many ways, you could say it's the most sort of just stripped down, bare bones security plan. Here are the 12 things you need to make sure you cover, kind of thing. And why do you have to do this? Well, this is put out by the payment card industry. That's the credit card companies. So if you do not follow these standards and are ultimately found in lack of compliance with these PCI DSS standards, and your company takes credit cards, debit cards, etc., and you're out of compliance, you can lose your right to take credit cards. And of course, if you are pretty much dependent, 80% of your revenue came from credit card purchases and you lost your ability to take payment, you could put your company out of business. So the PCI DSS is what's covered in lesson 7, and it has sort of 12 realms, areas that it works on. But if you kind of look at it, and especially as you get deeper in this, you look at some of the other ones and you learn more throughout the program, you'll realize that, that is a bare bones. They make you do certain bare bones things. They want to make sure that everyone has a unique account. We want some accountability. If somebody has access to that potential credit card information, that they're auditable. That information is protected in all of its forms, and we'll talk about this multiple times throughout the semester, but data can be in use, like while it's on the processor. Of course, you transmit data, and data has to be at rest. So data in motion, data in use, data at rest. You have to protect data in all of its states, and they require that, and then they require encryption. And so that means that when you're transmitting the data, you have to encrypt it. It has to be stored encrypted, has to be worked with software that is secure. And so you either have to build a compliance system, or the easiest way for most small companies is either through their bank or payment vendor, they acquire some software and the hardware that's is all compliant. And so then they can get their job done. But they also have to do some security awareness training. That may not amount for a small company to anything more than one newsletter a year or a mention of security at the annual meeting. But there is the basics of the plan. And if you look at the PCIS as a very minimum, almost everybody takes credit cards. So you're going to have to do that. Whatever company you go for, the odds are you're going to take credit cards, take donations in credit cards, take debit cards, prepaid cards, whatever. If you go through that system, then you're going to need to follow at least those bare minimums. Now, the odds are your company's more than just some little crap company or a little XYZ, e-commerce company, and even if that's all you are there, if you start to reach out to other places, then you're not just a physical brick and mortar, but you're talking about being online. And then your customers can come from all over the world. So you may want to look at other standards. There are a lot of other standards, and that's actually what 8 is all about. And I'm not going to go through them all. There's a number of them, but the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is the U.S. body that puts out a bunch of these types of guidance, framework documents, and templates. ISO, many of you may have heard of ISO file. Maybe if you've worked at a manufacturer, ISO 9000, which is a quality certification. They're the International Standards Organization. They obviously put out all kinds of standards, and they have a ton of standards on cybersecurity that you can look at. The Europeans have their own body, and just like NIST, and then there are other ones that are tied to particular industries, electronics, obviously, communications, etc. And so you'll need to know some of those main ones that are mentioned in Lesson 8 that you might be asked about, NIST standards on a test question, or just, like I said, you need to be aware of all of them. Because when you go to work, the ideal way, if you go to work for a company that's already at least started a security policy, then you'll have some framework. They'll have already done this first step. But let's pretend you go to work for a startup, or you start your own company. And of course, maybe first off the bat, you're worried about getting your site up, selling product, making money, and you haven't really thought about, besides the back of your mind, security. Hopefully you use good passwords, change your defaults, all that kind of stuff we're going to talk about. But you finally, at some point, start hiring employees, realize I got to put some policies in place. I got to have some human resources policies. I got to have some payroll. I need some security policies. So what are we going to do? Well, you're going to look at starting at PCI DSS if you take any form of credit card. And even if you don't, it's just the barest minimum. So not a bad place to start. But then look what industry you're in. Are there any regulatory bodies? If you happen to be in healthcare, there's a whole bunch of rules about HIPAA, and private health information, PHI. Of course, just any kind of private information, and there are more and more rules that apply. Different states have different rules, different countries have different rules. And so you can look at the national bodies to see what their guidelines are. You can look at industry bodies and see what their guidelines are. And you need to be aware of these things. And so what sort of like writing a resume, you're going to look at maybe 3 templates and say, I like how they list the skills. I like how this one list the jobs. And I'm going to build my own resume. And here's my resume. Well, you look at all these different guidelines, these frameworks. I like how they do the risk assessment. I like how they do their controls. We need a password policy, and some of them provide you like draft documents. I mean, it's you just have to go in and fill in the blanks in a sense. Or they'll provide you with checklists to go through and check certain things as part of, say, a vulnerability assessment. So you want to look at a number of these and become familiar with them, at least at a high level, so that if that role does fall to you to help either create a brand new security policy, or even a company that already has one, and maybe they've gone through this a couple years ago and they took the best and they created, here's our document, here's our security policies. And then they merge or they change equipment or something major happens. And so as such, we need to go through. These are not just, yay, we wrote the document, we're done. No, that there's a constant iterative process of once you've created your security policies and procedures and set up your own organizational infrastructure, then you need to check and make sure and audit your own infrastructure, see if there's any issues, maybe even have outside auditors occasionally. And then, of course, respond and adapt. If you find vulnerabilities, you need to address them and mitigate them. And if things change in your organization, you add new facilities, you merge with somebody, whatever, then you'll have to go back and go through the exercise again. So you'll spend a lot of time over your life, actually, one way or the other, working directly or indirectly with these frameworks or the individual components. And so, in most cases, what your goal is you're going to create a sort of overall corporate policy. Our policy is to be, very secure and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And then out of that will come, sort of guideline documents. We're attempting, we're going to, it may be a more general description of how 8 different areas are going to work. Our general work, groups are going to be under this. Our R&D is going to be supercomputer or whatever. And then out of that comes individual policies. And that goes down to things like acceptable use policy, email policy, NDAs, anything like that may be employees may have to deal with. But we're also talking about like the policies that we document. How do we set up a new system? We set it up, we patch it, we install this antivirus, we do these things, we lock down these permissions. This is our standing rule on how we set up a new workstation. How about a new router? How about a firewall? And we document all these things so that we have this trail. And then if anybody else comes in or we bring in another piece of equipment, then we don't have to go, what do we do with it? Oh, we're swapping out firewalls. Well, okay, it's just the same one. So let's go to our document. Maybe we can even transfer the old config, but let's say it's pretty much the same, but a slightly different model. So we're going to have to reset it up. And we're going to follow our document. Okay, we allow these ports in and we close everything else, and we have these rights, and we set it up with only whitelisted addresses from the management LAN that can get into it, whatever our rules are. And so that's what basically 6, 7, and 8 are all about, is to get you familiar with these types of security frameworks that will help us build an organization's security policy. As we move on, the next unit is a return to threat actors. And we've already talked about threat actors, and actually, because I can't help myself when I talk about them, I kind of hit some of what's in here too when it comes to the attributes of threat actors. And it's important to understand them because that will, it sometimes, by understanding the threat actors, not only who they are, but what their attributes are, you can help sort of define who you're up against, and that may, of course, then dictate how your response may be different. So, for example, I referenced that the script kiddies, the folks every year at Christmas to get a new computer and start hacking, and then the few that have just been dabbling away with it over time, and that have just started doing, downloaded a tool and they're off and running. These folks are, kind of amateurish, less experienced. And so we have a situation that they're using automatic scripts most of the time, etc. They usually don't have, a huge server farm that they can use and all kinds of huge resources. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, if we all up to nation state actors, or whether direct or indirectly sponsored, they many times, of course, have lots of skill, lots of money, lots of technologies. And that's even led to an acronym, lots of them in our industry, with APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. Script kiddie blows by, pounding away on those weak passwords. If you've done everything right, it's going to go right away. Your systems are going to block it, and it's not even something you worry about. But of course, the advanced persistent threat isn't doing such a overt pound away. It's much more subtly, finding and then exploiting and breaking in, many times quietly, through maybe a backdoor or a zero exploit, and then just patiently, slowly. Some of these higher end attacks that are taking sometimes weeks, months to be found out, let alone announced. And then we find out after the analysis is done that they had actually been in for months before that. So, this isn't like alarms going off and everybody immediately fights, pulls that machine off. No, these people at the higher end can get in and slip in and stay in if you don't do things right and you don't have those multiple layers, and if they've taken advantage of some weakness in the system somewhere. So, there's a spectrum there. The amateurs don't have as many resources that obviously the professionals do. And then in the middle, it kind of varies. Some of the activists, if they have a big enough group, or there's somebody, doing some funding, or there's enough of them getting together so they can pool resources. As the skill level goes up, they can add more resources, at least somewhat for free, because they can build their own botnet and thus have hundreds or thousands or more machines to be able to use to attack. So it's important to understand their attributes, because you can almost tell by what you see in your logs and in the activity on your network, on your machines, what you're up against. If you see these constant pounds of the same IP hitting the same, login port and fail, that's a script kiddie. And, obviously you can block those types of things. If you have to keep that port open, you can't block the port. You can block their IP address if they're coming from just one unique one. Of course, if they've stepped up and now they're using a botnet and they're coming from all over, that becomes more of a challenge. And many of these things, to be honest, especially when that's how they're operating these days, you just have to, there's really not much you can do. I mean, you're not going to set your lockout to one fail, right? Because it take your users off if they missed their password one time and they're locked out. So usually that's set to 2 or 3, at a minimum. And so these, of course, the hackers now will try an account once from an IP, try it again a little bit later, try it again a little bit later. There's no pattern. They're bouncing from all over the world where they've taken machines over. And so how do you block that? Well, of course, you don't have bad passwords, maybe you've already, like one of the ones I love to see constantly, and it's pretty common, is that you'll see attempts to log in as the root user and as the admin or administrator more times than not, which is really, really common because obviously if somebody can get the root or the admin administrator for Windows, then they own that server, right? And so they will constantly be doing that. So if you've disabled or disallowed, say for example, root remote access, they can pound away all day, and even if they guess the password, they still wouldn't get in because that is not allowed. Now you wouldn't want a weak password because then they'd get in through some other weak user and then switch to root because you had a weak password. But combining all these things, so the idea is that being aware of the types of things, you're going to see very overt signals, which generally means the automatic or lower end of the spectrum. Kind of more anomalous things, then you might have somebody whose skill level is higher. And so these are the ones in the middle that, as I think I mentioned, when we talked about threat actors last week, we all have to worry about the script kiddies, but do things right, and you really don't have to worry about them. And then, of course, if you are in a targeted industry or for whatever reason becomes a target of a high-end group, criminal attackers, nation-state players, highly resourced, highly skilled, then those are going to be the biggest trouble. And you're going to have to really be on your game to stop them or minimize their ability to do anything if they happen to get in. Where we really spend a lot of our time is in that middle. These folks that are not amateurs, but they're not the highest end, and they're out there, criminal groups and other types of groups, hacktivists and otherwise, that are attempting to target a broader range, and that's where most companies are going to see their biggest threat. Most companies aren't being targeted by the U.S. or Chinese or Russian or Israeli spies. Some, if you're in military defense, you're a defense contractor, you're in certain fields, then yes, then you need to even have your game up at another level. And all the things we teach you will help with any of them if you do it right, and especially if you do the complete program of layered defenses and complete circle of not just putting up defenses, but checking your own defenses and having multiple ways to monitor things. And once you put all that together and build your system, if your need is that high, then you're going to have many, many layers and much diversity and many, many different people looking at things, many different systems looking at things, inside, outside, and by those kinds of mechanisms, then you can, obviously minimize the chance that even the most experienced can get in. For the average company, the most experienced individual is not the problem. It's the more middle of the road. But obviously, we can once again design our systems and to prevent that. Now, the other part of that that's important that we haven't covered is what we call non-human threat actors. And actually, while hackers get all the attention, in security, I'm going to be completely honest with you and say that it is entirely likely that you have probably as much, maybe more, depending on where you live, I guess, that's going to vary too, but you have as much or maybe more of a chance that a disruption that becomes a huge IT event that you have to deal with. Remember our job, confidentiality, integrity, that's all protecting it, the hacker. Don't let them change it, don't let them get into it. But then there's availability. We have to make those resources available so our organization can do its job. And obviously, if a hacker gets in and takes down a site, then we've failed availability. But if a fire burns down our data center and we have no backup plan, we have failed availability, and no hacker had anything to do with it. If we have a data center in Florida and we don't have a backup center somewhere planned, we don't have some kind of business continuity, disaster recovery planning in mind, which we'll talk about next to wrap up, then we're kind of screwed, right? We could be out of business. That could be it. Our data center just flooded and there's no way. Think about what happened with the floods in that factory that was on fire in Houston with Harvey, or what happened to Katrina, or some of the other storms that have just been the perfect storms that have really come in and set some place and just devastated. For weeks, power is out. For weeks, you don't have public services, roads are flooded, you can't do things. If that is your only place of business, that kills companies. If that is a critical center, even in a big nation or international company. So we need to think about these things. And so anything that is potentially fire, riots, war, natural, everything that insurance companies like to call acts of God, things that are out of your control. A revolution, you're an international company and you happen to have a facility in a country that has a civil war. Okay, what do you do? So the idea is that don't get so focused on, yes, we got to focus on hackers and we're defending against the active and the automatic. But we also have to, as part of this, remember that availability piece that, A, we have to keep it available. And that's not just hackers. If the building just goes down, what if our internet connection goes down and we only have one? What's our rollover? What's our plan? What is our plan if our data center goes down? What if the power goes out because of, like, it's been a number of years since one's happened so bad in the States, but we had some rolling blackouts in Texas a couple years ago, and brownouts, which didn't help the situation for technical companies here during one of those really, really hot summers. But we, of course, had, I think it was in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, it's been a while. But nonetheless, a time when pretty much the whole eastern seaboard went out pretty much for one transformer blowing in the wrong place that didn't chain reaction across the system. And don't even get us talking about someday if somebody, the bad hacker folks want to take down infrastructure. They're coming closer and closer to the ability to do physical damage in the real world through hacks. And we may have already almost had one last year. So we're going to see more of this. So take the non-human threat actors in play. And that actually helps us kind of roll into our last chapter and wrap up this course, which is a chapter called Organizational Security. When you get down to it, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to secure our organization. And organizational security is a subset of overall cybersecurity. And you can look at it as the part that's kind of more the paperwork part. It's the part that's more the planning part, the analyzing, thinking part, not the setting up firewalls and hacking and counter hacking and whatever, monitoring. This is actually your business analysis. And so what we look at is, of course, everything we do to protect our company's infrastructure and informational assets, we call it broadly a control. So if we put a firewall, that's a technical control. We put a password policy, that's a technical control. We put in an acceptable use policy, that's an administrative control, a rule. And of course, some controls work in the front, they try to prevent things from happening. Some of them work after the fact. Some can carry multiple roles. Antivirus theoretically can be a preventative control, prevent a virus, or can, as soon as it sees it, clean it, take action, and be a reactive control. So there's all different kinds of controls, and they can be technical, they can be procedural, they can be policy-based, etc. And so what we have to do ultimately is we're going to have a whole series of controls, but we don't start with individual controls. We start top down more times than not. We look at the organization. What is the organization trying to accomplish? What is the organization's mission? How do we empower that with IT? And what are the important pieces of the infrastructure that without which the organization can't achieve its goals? So if you're an online e-commerce company, it's super critical you keep your website up, right? And if you're just a restaurant, the website may be important because it's got directions and a menu, but it's not as critical. So every organization has to go through their own internal analysis, and you do what's called risk assessment. You look at everything. You look at any time when basically some of the things we've learned about, like threats and risk and vulnerabilities, come together. Okay, so we have a web server. Okay, and we know there's hackers out there that target web servers. So we have a potential vulnerability and we have a threat. If they come together, that means we have a risk. And that risk of that site being compromised or taken down is X. It is something. We have to quantify it or qualify it. And actually, when you do risk assessments, there's two ways to do it. You can do a qualitative, which is basically one of these. You look at something and say, so if we use those examples, the e-commerce company and the restaurant, they both have websites, and we're just going to look at the website. So the e-commerce company has a website, and we know there's a possible risk there, and so does the restaurant. But the e-commerce company is going to rate the risk of that going down and the impact on them, business impact analysis of it, its impact is very high, because if they go down for any period of time, they could be out of business. These guys aren't going to rate the risk of the web going down quite as bad, right? I mean, they're going to have it. They're going to try to protect their website, but if it happens to go down or somebody throws, some political slogan on their website, it's going to look bad. But it's not the end of the world, right? They don't have a whole bunch of customers' data and information here. They have a menu and a map to their store. Come on in and order a pizza. Over here, these guys have, like Amazon, thousands of people, whoever it is. They don't have to be that big, but you get the idea. And every company goes through this process of looking at where they have risk. Do we have computers? Do we have wireless? Are we on the Florida coast or the California coast? Or are we someplace where a volcano could go off? I mean, this is the world we live in. You need to plan for all these things. And we do a risk analysis. We look at what is the impact of these things. And then, of course, this helps us. And ideally, we want to do a qualitative. I mean, not a qualitative. That's the very high versus moderate risk, where we just kind of gut it, if you will. But ideally, we want to do calculations. We want to do some math. We want to know, okay, we make $10,000 an hour off this website. So obviously, if we go down, that's at least a $10,000 an hour cost for this e-commerce company. These guys make nothing from their website, but it does lead to a customer coming in or somebody calling and order a pizza once in a while or whatever. So there would be some loss. So we could make estimates. This website, 10,000 an hour, this one, 50. Maybe it makes us 50 a day, because most of our customers repeat, they don't go back to the website, but we can put numbers to that. So obviously this company is willing to spend thousands of dollars to prevent that website going down for even an hour, and it would still be a win for them. This guy is not going to spend much, right? This restaurant is not going to spend as much on security of the website because the loss to them is not as bad. Now, you got to take into effect intangible things. It's not just the $10,000 and the $50 that are lost. I'm trying to keep my bar. Maybe I should have a much higher bar chart using my arms to make a bar chart. But there's other costs. You're going to have to fix that web server, get it back up over time. You're going to have lost some customers, right? That may never come back because they tried to come, couldn't go. You were compromised, so they went somewhere else. They never come back. Pizza Guy has the same issue. That one customer that didn't get there that day could have been a lifelong customer, right? That now, after finding the site. So we have to factor all of those intangibles in the recovery time and how much it's going to cost to get back up and running. And so this company might have a backup data center sitting there in some form, and we'll talk about those more later, but there's all different models of having cold, hot, warm, whether there's a site that's like ready to instantly switch over and take over. Or, it's sort of like how when the president gets on Air Force One, everything switches theoretically, right? So that's a hot, as soon as he gets on that plane, it becomes the flying office and has all the control. And that's a hot site. And if you have a hot backup site, then you can instantly flip a switch, change your DNS entries, and have everybody start routing, to the new site. And it's almost seamless when the other side goes down. But obviously that's expensive to keep a duplicate site up with everything ready to go instantly and nothing happening. And so, of course, we have to look at that. And so restaurant is not going to have a hot site. They're going to have a backup of their website, and they're going to re-upload and overwrite the site. And this guy, they might have some kind of a backup site. So that's what the organizational security is all about. As we go through the process of doing risk assessment, we do an analysis, we do a risk assessment, and we look at what we need to do. We rate and prioritize. We get budget and management backing, and ultimately we do planning for business continuity. What are we going to do if something happens? And then, of course, that's a big event, whether that's a major breach or a hurricane. That's when you have to kick in your business continuity disaster recovery planning. But you also want to form, an incident response team, and you're going to set up policies and procedures when just something more minor happens. Susie in accounting got a virus. Bill in finance got a virus. That's an incident, and maybe that is completely isolated to just that machine. It's not a major breach. Nobody, the finance person might have, you have to do the analysis. So somebody's going to have to come in, or a team of people are going to come in. We're going to isolate the machine. We're going to forensically analyze it. We're going to isolate that segment, make sure it didn't spread, and basically contain, mitigate, control, and of course then recover and get that machine back up and running, either by replacing it or by taking an image of all that data off and then restoring it so we can look at that and analyze what happened. Oh, that was just one of those drive-by things that they clicked the wrong button and they only got on their machine, so it was some malware. It was malware, but it didn't do anything. Our firewalls blocked it from talking out, or whatever the case is, or that's how we triggered it. Some strange traffic left our network trying to reach command and control server or something. So an incident response team would need to respond to an incident, but it may not be, a huge, company-wide event, but you still need to have policies and procedures in place. And so that's this introduction course, is that now you know what security is, what we're trying to defend against, some of the challenges, all the breadth and depth of what we have to do. And ultimately, we're going to put a plan in place for our organization that dictates our standard, our policy, our statement, if you will, where we are, various guidelines that will then drive individual policy positions and papers and statements. And some of these are documents that are just documenting, this is the config for our secure routers. This is our acceptable use policy. This is this. And then, even things like, this is our plan. We're going to run vulnerability testing against our systems every so often. We're going to have an outside auditor check us once a year. All of this is part of your security plan. And it's multiple documents, and ultimately they are a living, breathing set of things that over time will change as you need to adapt them to your organization's changes. As I glance in my notes here, let's see, is there anything else? Oh, one thing, we talked about risk analysis, risk assessment, being the driver here. Organizations do their own analysis, look at their own situation, and even two similar organizations are going to make different decisions about how much money they're willing to spend to defend against X to Y, web attack, network attack, this or that, depending upon their own needs and their own potential assessments of what that impact would be if those things happen. But when you look at risk, there is one last topic, I kind of missed my notes in the corner here, but it's an important one. There are pretty much 4 things you can do with risk. Okay, you can, and it's basically what we're trying to do in this field. We can avoid those risks. Okay, so using the websites again, technically we could avoid the risk by taking down the websites. Now the restaurant might do it if it doesn't really a huge deal for them. Probably not in this day. Everybody's got to have a website, right? But nonetheless, these guys that make $10,000 an hour, unless they're going to build a store and somehow replicate making that much money in a physical bricks and mortar, they're not taking the site down. So avoiding that risk in that case of just getting rid of it is not a possibility. So we can mitigate it. We can set up protections. We can have that backup site. We can have the hot site. And so in this case, we are reducing that risk. Instead of avoiding it, we're going to mitigate it. We're going to minimize it. We're going to have plans in place in case it does happen, right? That's, that. And then, of course, we can transfer the risk. That's what insurance is. Most of us don't have sprinklers in our houses, though many buildings do. We don't. Houses, thankfully, knock on wood, they're built pretty well, good safety standards. People aren't using, wood-burning fires just to cook every meal anymore, and open fires in the middle of their little wooden house. And so, we have fireplaces and safety, and most people don't even use fireplaces anymore, it doesn't seem. So thankfully, houses don't burn down as often. So we don't have it's a risk. We live in wooden houses for the most part, but they're built so well, and we have good fire responses in most places. And so most of us have fire insurance to, transfer that risk away. And then, so you can avoid a risk completely, just get rid of it. You can mitigate or reduce that risk in some form or fashion. You can transfer it, like with insurance, or you can just accept it. So once again, we look at the website companies. These folks might at the end of the day go, really? I mean, it's there. We like to show people. Occasionally somebody will Google, and find us through the web, so we get a new customer. But it's just not a huge thing. It's more important that we keep our building physically secure. Somebody didn't break in and steal our money. Somebody doesn't get into our point of sale system and start skimming credit cards, because then customers aren't going to come back, essentially. And so they're going to put their money there. And these guys who don't have to worry about any of that except for securing their office where their support staff and management people and administrative people are, they're worried about their website. And they're worried about it being down for minutes, because it's thousands of dollars, tens of thousands an hour. So even minutes they start to stack up real quick. So they're going to spend a lot more money in their plan of how they're going to respond to the possibility of that site or data center or being breached or going down, physically losing power or whatever is going to be a different outcome. They're not just going to avoid that risk. They're going to deal with it somehow, right? So anyway, those are the 4 things about risk, and this whole that helps you bring it all together. If you have any questions, of course, drop me a message on Slack or via email. Looking forward to seeing a couple of hopefully all of you. I know that not everybody's fully progressed, but this is midweek, so you still got some time to knock out your last few lessons and be able to progress to the Network Foundations course next week. And so I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks.